Trade agreements. What is a trade agreement? A trade agreement is an agreement between any two or more countries where they choose and determine what the tariffs and duties should be that are imposed on each other for imports and exports between each other. Trade agreements are more complicated than that though, as there are a few different types of trade agreements, 3 to be specific. There are unilateral trade agreements, bilateral trade agreements, and multilateral trade agreements. A unilateral trade agreement is when a country imposes some trade restrictions, but no other country does the same. Countries can also unilaterally loosen trade restrictions. However, that is very rare, as it puts that country at a disadvantage, and is generally only done as a type of foreign aid. Secondly, there are bilateral trade agreements, which are between two countries. It happens when two countries agree to loosen trade restrictions between each other by lowering tariffs. The point of this is to be able to have more business opportunities between them, and also for each country to protect its domestic industries, like the food, automotive, or oil industries in that country, to name a few. Lastly, there are multilateral trade agreements, which consists of 3 or more countries and are also the most complex and difficult to negotiate. The more countries there are, the more difficult to negotiate and the more complicated these agreements become. This is due to the fact that each country has its own needs and requests. However, if a multilateral trade agreement can be successfully negotiated, then they can be very powerful, as all the countries must agree to treat each other equally. But what are the effects of trade agreements? As with anything, there are always some pros and cons. When tariffs are lowered or removed, they lower prices of imports, which is a pro for consumers, as those products can be sold for cheaper. However, this can damage some domestic companies or industries, as they may not be able to compete with the low prices of some imported products. The WTO, World Trade Organization. Trade agreement can be very large and powerful. So once they hit the international level, they need some sort of regulation. So in comes the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization is an international organization that helps negotiate and enforce trade agreements, and even responds to complaints some countries may have about their trade agreements. In Canada, the most notable free trade agreement was NAFTA, also known as the North American Free Trade Agreement. However, with the recent ending of this agreement comes in the USMCA, or the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. It was signed off on November 30th, 2018. However, it is not yet in effect and is still pending ratification. Canada currently has 14 free trade agreements in effect that represent $507 billion in imports and $533 billion in exports as of 2018.